You walk into an Australian supermarket thinking you are playing it smart. Fresh fish on ice, frozen fillets on special, responsibly sourced salmon stacked in neat little rows. But what most Australians do not see is the recalls, mislabeling, imported basa, and greenwash salmon marketing sitting quietly behind those glass cabinets. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on 5 types of Australian grocery stores and supermarket fish sections you should think twice about buying from before you throw your money, and possibly your health, into the deep end. If you stick with me right to the end, I will show you where to actually find safer, cleaner, genuinely Australian seafood and how to spot the fakes in under 10 seconds just by reading the label differently and asking 1 or 2 simple questions. Australians are constantly told that fish is the clean protein, good for your heart, light on the stomach, a smarter choice than red meat. So we naturally assume that buying fish from big, brightly lit supermarkets must be safe and responsible. But here is the part almost nobody talks about. Australia is a seafood powerhouse that exports a lot of premium catch, but it actually imports roughly 60 to 75% of the seafood we eat, mostly as frozen fillets, frozen prawns, and canned fish from overseas. Sustainable seafood guides and government trade reports show that canned tuna and salmon, frozen fish fillets, prawns and squid are the major imported items, and that more than half of all fresh and frozen seafood imports are frozen fillets and frozen prawns, predominantly from Thailand, China, New Zealand and Vietnam. Frozen and thawed basa catfish fillets from farms in Vietnam are now described as some of the most commonly and widely eaten imported fish in Australia, simply because they are so cheap and fit perfectly into supermarket value ranges. At the same time, researchers from Macquarie University have found that around 70% of shark fillets sold in Australian markets and seafood shops are mislabeled, and that 88% of samples sold as flake were not even from the 2 shark species officially allowed to carry that name under the Australian Fish Names Standard. 9 of those flake samples were actually from shark species listed as threatened in Australia, including the critically endangered scalloped hammerhead and school shark. And you would never know that from the label on the packet or the sign above the counter. Meanwhile, large supermarkets selling Tasmanian farmed salmon, including Coles, Woolworths and Aldi, have been targeted in a formal complaint to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission by environmental lawyers, who argue that these companies may be misleading consumers when they promote Tasmanian salmon as responsibly sourced without clearly disclosing when it comes from Macquarie Harbour, the last known home of the endangered Maugean skate. Separate complaints under international guidelines have also alleged that Woolworths has continued to label its own brand salmon from Macquarie Harbour as responsibly sourced, despite government conservation advice that identifies salmon farms there as a high-risk threat to the Maugean skate and to parts of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. So this is not about one dodgy fillet. It is about an entire system where long, murky supply chains, vague labels, and glossy sustainability claims sit between you and the ocean. Let us go through the 5 grocery store fish traps you need to recognize and avoid if you care about what you are really eating and what you are supporting with your money. Number 5, the deep discount freezer aisle at very cheap supermarkets. If you have ever grabbed fish from the discount freezer at a supermarket like Aldi, you know exactly what it looks like. Big blue or green boxes, friendly brand names like Ocean Rise or the Fishmonger, bags of white fillets that promise weeknight dinners for half the price of anything at the local fishmonger. On the surface, it looks like smart budgeting. Underneath, you are often buying into the dirtiest and most anonymous end of the global seafood market. Let us start with basa, the cheap white fillet that shows up in freezers across Woolworths, Coles, Aldi and IGA. GoodFish, which is the sustainable seafood guide produced by the Australian Marine Conservation Society, gives imported basa from Vietnam a red rating because of ongoing concerns about the environmental cost of basa farming in the Mekong River region. Basa is mainly farmed in ponds, tanks and cages along the Mekong River, and farm waste and wastewater are discharged back into the river, adding to pressure on an already stressed waterway. That is already not the ocean fresh story you probably had in mind when you saw the fish photo on the box. Then there is the food safety and quality side. A survey published by Food Standards Australia New Zealand found that 7 imported aquacultured fish samples tested positive for chemical residues, and all 7 of those samples were basa from Vietnam that contained the antibiotic-related compound leucomalachite green. Other reports have described consignments of Vietnamese fish, including basa fillets and catfish, being stopped or rejected because they contained antibiotics that are banned in Australia, such as enrofloxacin, which raise concerns about antibiotic resistance and consumer safety. More recent research on farmed catfish fillets, including Pangaea species related to basa, has highlighted microbiological risks, including the presence of bacteria like Staphylococcus species and Escherichia coli at levels that show how easily contamination can happen when hygiene during farming, processing or handling is not perfect, even if most samples in those studies still met formal safety limits. The point is not that every single basa fillet is poisonous. The point is that basa has a long documented history of residues and quality problems that have forced regulators to monitor it closely and to block some shipments at the border. GoodFish makes it very clear that, while some improvements in basa farming are underway, ongoing concerns around the environmental cost of basa production and its heavy reliance on wild-caught fish for feed still justify a red rating overall. At the same time, frozen and thawed basa fillets from Vietnam have become some of the most commonly eaten imported fish in Australia, because supermarkets and food service operators love how cheap and flexible they are. Those cheap boxes in the deep discount freezer are exactly how that happens. And it is not just basa. In May 2023, Aldi had to recall its ocean rise anchovy fillets in olive oil and its ocean rise anchovy fillets in olive oil with chili, sold nationally in 100-gram jars, because food safety testing found elevated histamine levels that could cause illness if consumed. These products were pulled from shelves nationwide, and shoppers were advised not to eat them and to return them for a refund. So ask yourself this: when a box or a bag of fish is half the price of anything local, and the tiny print on the back says product of Vietnam, Thailand, China, or another low-cost export country, is that really a bargain? Or are you quietly shifting the true cost onto environmental damage overseas and a higher chance of quality or residue issues? The branding on those boxes promises light, versatile fillets, perfect for family meals. What it really often means is this: you are buying the very bottom of the global seafood supply chain, wrapped in a pretty packet. If you are thinking, fine, I will just go big and buy in bulk at a warehouse club like Costco, that has to be better quality. Number 4 shows how the warehouse model can quietly supercharge these exact same risks. Number 4, the big warehouse freezers and bulk club stores. Warehouse clubs feel like a playground for budget-focused families. Giant bags of prawns, 2-kilo slabs of salmon, family-sized cartons of frozen crumbed fish portions that look perfect for meal prep and school lunches. On the surface, everything screams value and convenience. Underneath, you are getting an amplified version of the same import-heavy, anonymous supply chain problems. Remember that Australia already imports a majority of the seafood we eat, and that more than half of all fresh and frozen seafood imports are frozen fillets and frozen prawns, mostly from Thailand, China, New Zealand and Vietnam. Those are exactly the kinds of products that end up in large, frozen multi-packs in warehouse trolleys because the business model is built on volume and low per-kilo prices. That is not automatically unsafe. But the larger and more complex the supply chain, the more things you need to go exactly right. Those huge packs may have been frozen overseas, shipped long distances, moved between storage sites, transported to the store, and then stocked and restocked in freezers before you ever see them. If the cold chain is not perfect at every step, fish can be partially thawed and refrozen. Ice glazing can be used to hide dehydration or freezer burn, and the real quality can drop while the outside still looks fine. Big packs also encourage a particular kind of behavior at home. You tell yourself you are saving money by buying 5 kilograms of fillets or prawns at once. Then you let that bag sit in your freezer for months, sometimes well past the best before date, because it does not obviously look spoiled. Over time, flavor, texture and nutritional quality all slide, especially if your home freezer is opened and closed constantly. A lot of the salmon sold in large slabs in these environments is farmed Atlantic salmon, often imported, not wild fish. Intensive salmon aquaculture has its own long list of environmental controversies, including high stocking densities, the use of pesticides and treatments to manage parasites, and dependence on industrial feed that often includes fish meal and fish oil from other wild fisheries. When you buy a 2-kilo slab of imported salmon or a huge bag of generic white fish from a warehouse freezer, you are making 3 big assumptions. You are assuming that the foreign farming or fishing practices are solid. You are assuming that the cold chain from factory to store to your home has been perfect, and you are assuming that you will cook, eat and store that fish in a way that keeps the risk low and the quality high. That is a lot of faith to place in a product whose main selling point is simply how big and cheap it is. The marketing message says, stock up and save. In reality, you may be locking yourself into a long relationship with fish that has traveled further than most Australians ever will. With a supply chain and production story you are never really shown. If you are now thinking, all right, I will avoid the bargain bins and only buy fish from the proper fresh counters at Coles or Woolworths, number 3 is where the word fresh starts to fall apart. Number 3, the fresh fish counters at the big supermarkets. You know the look. Crushed ice, fillets laid out under bright lights, little signs saying fresh Australian this and responsibly sourced that. Coles and Woolworths want you to feel like their seafood counters are basically indoor fish markets with supermarket convenience. But once you zoom out and remember the numbers, the picture changes. We have already seen that somewhere between roughly 66 and 75% of the seafood Australians eat is imported, with frozen fillets and prawns dominating the import list. Sustainable Seafood Information points out that frozen and thawed basa fillets from Vietnam are now among the most commonly eaten imported fish here. So when you see fresh fish in a glass cabinet at a major supermarket, there is a very real chance that it started life as an imported frozen product that has been thawed for display and rebranded as fresh. The fish may have been handled by multiple people as it moved from boxes in the back room to the counter, repackaged or reweighed, and relabeled with simplified terms that tell you very little about species, fishing method, or farming system. Then there is the shark and flake issue. Macquarie University researchers collected shark fillets from markets, seafood retailers and takeaway outlets across several Australian states. They found that around 70% of shark products were mislabeled in some way when compared to the Australian fish name standard, and that mislabeling was particularly widespread for products sold as flake. 88% of samples sold as flake were not from the two shark species that are allowed to be called flake under the official naming standard, which are gummy shark and New Zealand rig. 9 of those flake samples came from shark species that are listed as threatened in Australia, including scalloped hammerhead and school shark. Although that study focused on fish markets and takeaway shops, the underlying problem does not stop at supermarket doors. Anytime you see vague labels like flake or simply shark in a big retail environment, you are facing the same core issue. You do not truly know which species you are eating or what its conservation status is. The sign above the ice might say fresh flake, perfect for frying. What that can really mean is a random mix of shark species, possibly including threatened ones, sold under a name that hides what you are actually eating. On top of that, those counters often carry cold smoked fish like smoked salmon and smoked trout, and ready-to-eat seafood salads and antipasto, which public health agencies overseas have specifically identified as higher-risk foods for listeria infection in pregnant women, older people and those with weakened immune systems. Food safety authorities in the United Kingdom, for example, now advise pregnant women and people with weakened immune systems to avoid eating ready-to-eat cold smoked fish, such as smoked salmon and smoked trout, unless it has been thoroughly cooked because of repeated outbreaks of listeriosis linked to these products. So when you queue up at a big supermarket seafood counter thinking you are getting market-fresh fish, you might actually be getting previously frozen imports, vaguely labeled shark, and high-risk ready-to-eat items that health agencies quietly tell vulnerable people to avoid or treat with great caution. If you have ever brought home fish from a major supermarket that smelled strange or turned mushy very quickly, you have already felt what happens when the perfect image on the ice does not match the real journey that fish has taken. If you are now telling yourself, fine, I will just stick to salmon because it is proudly Tasmanian and clearly labelled as responsibly sourced, number 2 is where the marketing and the environmental reality crash into each other. Number 2, the responsibly sourced Tasmanian salmon walls. For years, salmon has been sold to Australians as the ultimate healthy aspirational protein. Pink fillets, omega-3 fatty acids, Tasmanian scenery on the packet. Supermarkets like Coles, Woolworths and Aldi cover their Tasmanian salmon ranges with phrases like responsibly sourced and stamp them with certification logos. But in late 2023, environmental lawyers lodged a detailed complaint with the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, arguing that these supermarkets may be engaging in misleading or deceptive conduct over their salmon sustainability claims. The core issue is where some of that salmon is grown. Around 10% of Tasmania's salmon production has been reported as coming from farms in Macquarie Harbour, on the state's west coast. Macquarie Harbour is the last known home of the critically endangered Morgan skate, a very unusual ray-like animal that exists only in that system. Government conservation advice and scientific reports have linked salmon farming impacts in Macquarie Harbour, including pollution and low oxygen conditions, with the serious decline and extinction risk faced by the Morgan skate. Despite this, supermarkets have continued to market Tasmanian salmon as responsibly sourced, without clearly telling shoppers when products come from farms in Macquarie Harbour. The complaint to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission argues that by omitting that information, supermarkets may be giving shoppers an overly positive impression of the environmental performance of their salmon ranges. A separate complaint lodged under the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development Guidelines alleges that Woolworths has breached responsible business conduct standards by continuing to source salmon from Macquarie Harbour for its own brand range while labelling that fish as responsibly sourced, even though the Australian government has identified those farms as a high-risk threat to the Morgan skate. None of this means that the salmon itself is unsafe to eat in a direct food safety sense. Regulators still monitor salmon for contaminants, and nutrition experts still recognize salmon as a source of beneficial fats and protein. The point is that the eco-friendly image wrapped around those salmon fillets may not match the real environmental story behind some of the farms they rely on, especially in Macquarie Harbour. So, when you see a big supermarket sign that says responsibly sourced Tasmanian salmon, what it might actually mean is this. A portion of this salmon may be coming from a waterway where a unique Australian species is being pushed toward extinction, and you would have no way of knowing that from the label in front of you. If you care about what your food dollars support, that gap between marketing language and ecological reality really matters. If you are now thinking, all right, I will simply avoid salmon and stick to neutral-sounding white fish that must be safer and more straightforward, Number 1 shows why the words basa and flake should ring alarm bells no matter which supermarket you are standing in. Number 1. Any supermarket selling generic basa and flake without clear species and origin. This final trap is not about one chain or one store. It is about every mainstream Australian grocery outlet that sells fish under vague, catch-all names like basa, white fillets or flake, without telling you the species or giving meaningful origin details. Let us talk about basa again. As we have already seen, GoodFish gives imported basa from Vietnam a red rating because of ongoing concerns about its environmental footprint and its dependence on unsustainable feed sources. Basa is mostly farmed along the Mekong River in Vietnam in ponds, tanks and cages, and farm waste is discharged into waterways that are already under pressure from other human activities. A survey by Food Standards Australia New Zealand found that 7 imported aquacultured fish samples tested positive to chemical residues, and all 7 of those samples were basa from Vietnam that contained the antibiotic-related substance leucomalachite green. Reports from Australian and overseas regulators have described multiple consignments of Vietnamese farmed fish, including basa catfish fillets, being stopped or rejected because they contained banned antibiotics like enrofloxacin or other residues that did not meet food safety standards. Researchers looking at the chemical quality of frozen Vietnamese pangasius fillets, which include basa, have identified issues such as heavy metal contamination and markers of deterioration, and have called for stronger quality control all along the production and import chain. Other scientific work on farmed catfish fillets has highlighted how easily bacteria, including Escherichia coli and Staphylococcus species, can be present on processed fillets, especially when personal hygiene or handling practices during processing are not ideal, even when levels still sit inside formal microbiological limits. In practice, this means that when you buy a supermarket pack that simply says basa fillets, product of Vietnam, you are supporting a farming system that is under environmental scrutiny and that has needed close regulatory monitoring for residues and quality issues in the past. You are also taking on extra risk if you frequently undercook it, refreeze it after partial thawing, or keep it in your freezer for a very long time. Now let us look again at flake. Macquarie University scientists tested 91 shark flesh samples from markets, fishmongers and takeaway shops across 5 Australian states. They found that 70% of shark meat products were mislabelled in some way against the Australian fish name standard, which sets out which names are supposed to be used for which species. Mislabelling was particularly high for products sold as flake. 88% of samples labelled flake were not from the 2 shark species officially allowed to be called flake, which are gummy shark and New Zealand rig. 9 samples sold as flake were actually from 3 shark species that are listed as threatened in Australia, including the critically endangered scalloped hammerhead and the school shark. That is not a one-off slip. That is a structural problem where a vague traditional name is being used to hide what is really being sold. So when any supermarket, big or small, sells you a fillet or a crumbed product simply labeled flake, you have to ask what shark species this really is, whether it is from a population that is doing well or from a threatened stock, and why the seller is not confident enough to print the actual species name on the label. The marketing suggests an Australian favourite, perfect for the pan or air fryer. What it often means is this: you are eating shark, but you're not being told which species, and the science says there is a very real chance that the label does not match the reality. Between basa and flake, supermarkets have normalized a seafood category where ambiguity is built into the business model. That, more than any single recall notice, is why buying fish blindly from big grocery chains is such a risky habit if you actually care what is on your plate. The pattern you cannot ignore. This is not one bad fillet. Let us pull all the threads together. Across all 5 of these grocery store fish traps, you can see the same pattern. There is heavy reliance on imports. Government and industry sources say that around 2/3 to as much as 3/4 of the seafood Australians eat is imported, and that most of those imports are frozen fillets, frozen prawns and canned seafood. There is a strong focus on cheap farmed species. Imported basa from Vietnam and similar fish fill the discount freezers because they are cheap to produce and sell, even though sustainable seafood guides give them a red rating and regulators have had to manage residue and quality concerns for years. There is vague labeling. Names like basa, white fillets and flake tell you almost nothing about which species you are eating, how it was farmed or caught, or what its conservation status is. There are questionable sustainability and responsibility claims. Supermarkets use phrases like responsibly sourced on Tasmanian salmon, while environmental lawyers and conservationists argue that the story in places like Macquarie Harbour is being glossed over, particularly the risk to the endangered Morgan skate. And there are high-risk, ready-to-eat products that look luxurious and healthy, but are actually flagged by food safety agencies as foods that vulnerable people should treat with great caution, especially cold-smoked fish and some chilled seafood products that can carry listeria. The message here is not that every fillet at every supermarket is dangerous. The message is that the default seafood system we have drifted into, which is import-heavy, anonymous, and slickly marketed, makes it extremely hard for the average shopper to know what they are really getting. So how do you step out of that system without giving up seafood altogether? Let us talk about the Australian options that are actually worth your time and money, and then I will give you the 10-second label checks you can use in any store. Better option 1, use GoodFish and buy named, local species. Instead of grabbing whatever is on special, start using GoodFish, the Australian Marine Conservation Society Sustainable Seafood Guide. GoodFish lets you look up specific species by name, see which fish are green rated as better choices, which are amber, and which are red, and understand which fishing methods and regions are more sustainable or more problematic. At the counter or at a fishmonger, start asking for named Australian species. Think about Australian sardines, mackerel, mullet, whiting, flathead, squid, and other local fish that get good or at least reasonable scores in sustainability guides, depending on the fishery. If the label or the staff cannot tell you what species it is or where it comes from beyond a vague country name, that is your cue to walk away. Real transparency is a green flag. Vagueness is almost always a red one. Better option 2, choose real fishmongers and high turnover markets. The Great Australian Seafood Initiative and similar directories can help you find local retailers and fishmongers in your area that focus on Australian seafood. These places often turn stock over faster, are more used to answering questions about species, origin and method, and rely on reputation, not just national advertising. To survive, a practical rule you can use is this. Use supermarkets for tins, pantry staples, and frozen vegetables. Use fishmongers or good markets for fresh fillets and whole fish whenever you can. Even swapping one fish shop visit each fortnight for your usual quick grab from the supermarket counter can make a meaningful difference to what ends up in your freezer and on your plate. Better option 3. Avoid generic basa and flake altogether. Until supermarket labeling and sourcing practices improve, the simplest and clearest rule is this. Do not buy basa. Do not buy flake, unless you are absolutely sure it is properly labeled gummy shark from a fishery that sustainable seafood guides consider acceptable. There are plenty of other white-fleshed Australian fish that cook and taste just as well, including whiting, flathead, some snapper fisheries, and local reef fish depending on where you live and what the sustainability ratings are at the time. Yes, you will usually pay more per kilogram. But you are paying for a fish that actually has a name, a place, and a story, not just a generic label slapped on a box to hide what it really is. Better option 4. Be extra cautious with cold, smoked, and ready-to-eat seafood. If someone in your household is pregnant, elderly, undergoing treatment that weakens the immune system, or living with a serious underlying health condition, then follow the food safety agencies and treat cold smoked fish and ready-to-eat chilled seafood as high-risk foods. That means limiting or avoiding ready-to-eat cold smoked salmon, cold smoked trout, and similar items for those people, unless the fish is cooked thoroughly before serving. Choose cooked seafood options instead, such as grilled or baked fish, canned fish that is then heated, or freshly cooked prawns served hot. The rest of the family can still enjoy smoked fish occasionally if they choose, but at least you will not be serving the highest risk products to the people at your table who are most vulnerable to a severe infection. Better option 5. Read the back, not the front. No matter where you shop, make this a habit. On frozen fish, check the country of origin and the full species name on the back of the packet, not just the photo and marketing language on the front. On salmon, look for more detail than just Tasmanian, responsibly sourced. If the label does not tell you which region or give more transparency, assume that some of the product could include fish from more controversial areas like Macquarie Harbour. On pre-packed or marinated fish, look for short ingredient lists that mainly list fish, salt, oil and herbs, not long lists of stabilizers, sugars and generic flavorings. If the back of the packet tells a completely different story to the front, trust the back. The back is where the actual rules apply. The front is just advertising space. Your 10-second supermarket fish check. Here is the quick promise from the start of the video. In under 10 seconds, you can often spot the fakes and make a better choice, simply by doing this. Step 1. Only buy fish with a clear species name, not just basa, flake, white fillets, or other vague terms. If the label is vague, put it back. Step 2. Check country of origin. If it says, product of Vietnam for basa, or another low-cost export country with no detail, think carefully about the environmental and residue history behind that product. Step 3. For salmon, look for real detail about farming area or standards. If it only says Tasmanian responsibly sourced, remember the Macquarie Harbour concerns and decide if you want to fund that. Step 4. For cold smoked fish and ready-to-eat seafood, keep them occasional or avoid them entirely for anyone who is pregnant, elderly, or has a weak immune system. You do not need to fix the whole system, but you can stop buying the worst offenders and shift more of your seafood budget to clearly named local species. If this made you want to check the labels on your own fish, tap like, subscribe and turn on notifications, and share your supermarket fish stories in the comments. This video is general information and opinion only, not medical, nutrition, or legal advice. Always check current recall alerts, follow official food safety guidance, read labels yourself, and speak with a qualified health professional about your own situation.